Morning. Let us pray. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together in this time of worship and fellowship and learning about and meditating on your word. Today, as we delve further into the story of Job and into the nature of human suffering, I just ask that you touch all our hearts and minds with how we're able to cope with such things ourselves and how we're to render comfort to others. Praise in your name. Amen. Perfect. So first of all, just a quick special thanks to Ali in the sound booth last week. You know you're getting old when you start struggling with technology. So apparently I was fake clicking the entire time. And she was filling in the gaps for me there. So thanks for that. I think that's a real click. All right, so you can see today the agenda. We're going to finish the story of Job. It's a grand and majestic survey of one of the most ancient stories we have recorded. I will attempt to address the problem of evil a little bit from logical and philosophical standpoints, as well, more importantly, from existential and pastoral perspectives. I'll show you another brief story from my experiences, which hopefully will help illustrate those points. And then toward the end, we'll have some personal and pastoral applications, and hopefully you get some cash value out of everything that I've been reviewing. So once again, just a structure of the book of Job. So last week, we did the first bookend, the narrative prologue, the introduction of the situation, then the dialogues. We did the three dialogues with Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And then today, we're moving chapter 27 and onward to the three discourses, which is going to be Job's discourse, or kind of his rebuttal. Then Elihu is kind of an extra friend who's sort of a bystander until then, and he will speak up. And then finally, we're going to hear God's response. And then we have the second bookend, the narrative epilogue, which is the conclusion of the story, and thankfully, at least a partial vindication of Job, a kind of a bit of a happy ending. So just a point of perspective, if you're not a Christian, if you're an unbeliever or you're an atheist, we have the present life, and then it ends, and then there is oblivion. And so Richard Dawkins, a well-known biologist and speaker in this space, has a quotation here that illustrates what that perspective would look like. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. No design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. We should be thankful today that that's not going to be our perspective, because we believe in a God of salvation and a majestic afterlife and eternity. So going into the three discourses, chapter 27, Job proclaims his determination to live well and righteously and reaffirms the fact that evil will eventually be punished. Some scholars believe verse 7 refers to Job's friends as being his new enemies and that he is actually bringing a curse upon them. Also, there's a new formulation shown. Then Job continued his discourse, so that kind of just references an index that the story of the book is moving into a new direction. Verses 3 and 4, "For as long as life is in me, and the breath of God is in my nostrils, my lips certainly will not speak unjustly, nor will my tongue mutter deceit." 7 through 9, "May my enemy be as the wicked, and my opponent as the unjust. For what is the hope of the godless when he is cut off, when God requires his life? Will God hear his cry when distress comes upon him?" Chapter 28 speaks about true wisdom. Job notes that animals are unique among animals in exploring hidden regions, such as the depths of the earth via mining or the ocean, or I suppose now space in our time. But that the search for true wisdom is even more difficult. God understands its way and he knows its place. This is a bit of an obscure chapter, as some scholars believe it may have been added by an editor. Of course, those are critical scholars. since its contents almost single-handedly answer Job's questions and searchings. Basically, wisdom is worth more than riches, but the most important type of wisdom is to fear the God and to depart from evil. So basically, everything should be centered upon that when the chips are down. Chapter 29, Job recounts his previous life of esteem, the glory days, his time in the community, being able to make a positive impact on people's lives, and most importantly, having had a close relationship with God. The fact that his friends do not detract from his statements are a testament to his previous virtue. Then in contrast, chapter 30, Job goes over the present suffering, and his state is unbearable and humiliating in comparison. Verse 16, "And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have seized me." In chapter 31, integrity or bust, Job re-emphasizes his integrity and good character and calls curses upon himself if he has failed in any of his obligations. As you know, we are not to call curses upon ourselves or to make those kind of proclamations. We should just say yea or nay. Verses 7 to 8, "If my step has turned from the way, or my heart followed my eyes, or if any spot has stuck to my hands, let me sow and another eat, and let my crops be uprooted." Then it gets even more dramatic, verse 22. "Let my shoulder fall from the socket, and my arm be broken off at the elbow." We should note here, while Job's general righteousness is accepted, there is a risk in overemphasizing this. We would do well to remember 1 John 1 to 8. "If we say that we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us." There we go, deja vu here. All right, moving on. Now we have Elihu. He was off to the side, letting his elders speak first. And it says in the text that the three men, the first three initial friends, had stopped answering Job because they felt he was making himself righteous in his own eyes. So then Elihu goes on a bit of a rampage, directing his anger both toward Job, who he thought was self-righteous, and the three friends whom were thought to be useless. He wants to speak his piece, being younger, and claims that he will remain impartial. And as we know, there are at least two sides to every question or every problem. Chapter 33, Elihu disapproves of Job's proclamations of innocence, 8 and 9. "Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words. I am pure without transgression." Verse 12, "Behold, let me tell you, you are not right in this, for God is greater than man." And once again, Job was proclaiming his own righteousness, not absolute sinlessness, but simply that his punishment did not seem commensurate with his actions. Obviously, God is not accountable to us, and pain of the body is often a means of good to the soul. Chapter 34, Elihu states that Job has his just deserts. He hints at the sovereignty of God and there being no higher standard. It actually seems like Elihu is accusing Job of calling God a liar. 10 through 12. "Therefore, listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from wickedness and from the Almighty wrong, for he pays a man according to his work and makes him find it according to his way. Surely God will not act wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice." 33. "Shall he recompense on your terms because you have rejected it?" 35. There's discussion of a bit of a conflict or tension between God's immanence, that he upholds us, that he created everything, that every breath we draw is according to his will, that if the violinist stops playing the music, the song will end, versus God's transcendence, his being above us, unjudgeable by us, and ununderstandable to us. "If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are many, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness is for a man like yourself, and your righteousness is for a son of man." Verses 12 and 13. "There they cry out, but he does not answer. Because of the pride of evil men, Surely God will not listen to an empty cry, nor will the Almighty regard it. Chapter 36, Elihu brings up the discipline of suffering. He observes the general pattern with which God deals with men, and he ends with God's incomprehensibility. So verses 8 to 10, and if they are bound in fetters and are caught in the cords of affliction, then he declares to them their work and their transgressions, that they have magnified themselves. He opens their ear to instruction and commands that they return from evil. Verse 26, behold, God is exalted, and we do not know him. The number of his years is unsearchable. In chapter 37, Elihu concludes with the magnificence of God. This chapter also seems to be a foreshadowing of Job's imminent theophany, or his experience with the Almighty. Verse 5, God thunders with his voice wondrously, doing great things which we cannot comprehend. 19, teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot arrange our case because of darkness. 24, therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise of heart. Okay, now finally the moment we're waiting for, it's God's turn. So some things we should note about God's appearance and response to Job. So number one, there is no direct reference to Job's sinfulness or righteousness. We do know from the first chapter or two in the conversation between God and the Satan what God's opinion of Job is, but God does not deign to express that directly to Job during his response. God notes that the world is large and complex. He kind of hints at the why versus how of suffering, which I'll get into later. And most importantly, God's ways are not our ways. Chapter 38. God addresses Job, asking him if he is in a position to understand him. Job is told to prepare for a difficult encounter and is put in his place. God provides an overview of the breadth and complexity entailed with running a planet and universe. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Chapter 39, God speaks of nature and various created or sentient beings. Various spirited and or difficult to control animals are listed. The rhetoric being that God is able to manage all of them simultaneously, whereas Job cannot control the least of them. Verse 9 stands out as being kind of interesting. It reminded me of the animals in the manger during the birth of Christ, and I wondered whether it might be prophetic, but none of the commenters who I researched had mentioned it from that perspective at all, so I can only conclude that the manger scene might be more common than we might think in today's era. And then if you look at the verse further, some translations actually mention a unicorn instead of an ox, which is a whole other rabbit hole, which I don't have the time to go into here. Verse 9, will the wild ox consent to serve you, or will he spend the night at your manger? 40 is about the behemoth. God is directly asking Job kind of what's his deal, and will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Job retracts. God tells Job to man up. And then God demonstrates his power as illustrated in the behemoth. The behemoth is a land monster, some say a force of chaos. And then we get into Leviathan later, which is kind of the sea monster equivalent. Some commentators have suggested behemoth is a mythical creature. Others have said a hippopotamus, and still others a dinosaur. 1-4. Then the Lord said to Job, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. 6-8. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm and said, now gird up your loins like a man. I will ask you, and you instruct me. Will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Or do you have an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? 15 and 16. Behold now, behemoth, which I made as well as you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold now, his strength in his loins, and in his power in the muscles of his belly. Chapter 41, we move on to the Leviathan. There's an extended description of the might of Leviathan and God's might as reflected by it. Some say that it might refer to a giant crocodile, perhaps some kind of a whale creature. And then verse 11 has been suggested to mean that none may challenge God himself and escape unscathed. And this might actually include Job and be a hint of a warning. Verse 1, can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook or press down his tongue with a cord? 10 and 11, no one is so fierce that he dares to arouse him. Who then is he that can stand before me? Who has given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. Then moving into the last chapter, 42, in his time. Basically breaks down into three parts. We have Job's confession, God's displeasure, and then the restoration. Job's confession, he proclaims that God can do all things and that he, Job, cannot comprehend him. Job retracts all his objections and repents. Verses 2 to 6. I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes. God then utters his displeasure with Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. It looks like Elihu got a little bit of a reprieve. They did not speak properly of God, and he demands that they offer up a burnt offering, but they will be spared for Job's sake, and Job is to pray for them. Finally, we have a restoration of Job's fortunes. He now has 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys, seven sons and 3 daughters, which are, I guess, his family 2.0, better than the previous family. Some actual rabbinical traditions believe that his previous family was resurrected, but I don't think that that is borne out in the text. The daughters in this last chapter were described as the fairest in the land and being very virtuous and being like kind of the ideal woman from the Proverbs, in contradistinction to Job's wife in the beginning, who was telling him to curse God. So then, getting back to what I had introduced from the first part of the talk, is a logical approach to, in this case, the deductive problem of evil. So the basic form, as outlined there, I'll just briefly review with the initial premises and then with the 2 implied premises, which I brought forward last week. So all 5 are there. If God exists, then evil should not exist. Evil does exist. If God is omnipotent, then he can create any world he desires. If God is omnibenevolent, then he prefers a world without evil over a world with evil. Therefore, God does not exist. So this has been answered in various ways. One of the most famous is by Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher, who supposedly answered this question so compellingly that this is a rare thing in philosophy. The deductive problem of evil is just no longer discussed. It's no longer proposed, and both sides of the debate, or all sides of the debate, are pretty much settled that we should move on to other things. So of course, they still bring forth the problem of evil and attack the sovereignty of God, but they do so in other manners, using the inductive problem and other approaches. So according to Plantinga, with respect to God's omnipotence or being all-powerful, human evil might naturally result from creatures with libertarian freedom, kind of like a means to the end in a sense. So if you think of an unruly child and you're a parent, if you confine that child to his room forever, it's true, he'll no longer throw things or, insult the other children. You'll be preventing that evil. But the child will not develop any kind of control or self-discipline or affective regulation. And more importantly, they will never be in a position where they can show compassion or kindness to those children. So therefore, some level of freedom is needed in order that virtue may develop. With respect to God's omnibenevolence or being all good, suffering might be permitted in some cases to test or develop people or achieve some other end. This has been called the soul-making theodicy. God could not have created a world that had so much good as the actual world, but less evil. Moreover, God had morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil that exists. So that essentially says that the goodness to badness ratio, given various constraints, including free will, are as much as we could reasonably expect it to be. Of course, referencing morally sufficient reasons in the same sentence as God is absurd, because he is above us and he is the standard for everyone and everything. For a perhaps more concise and less technical answer to the problem, we have Norm Geisler's approach. So Dr. Geisler actually died 3 or 4 years ago. He was an apologist and author and theologian, and was one of the co-founders of Southern Evangelical Seminary, where I did my training. So his approach is here: God is all good and desires to defeat evil. God is all-powerful and is able to defeat evil. Evil is not yet defeated. Therefore, or I would suggest, however, it will one day be defeated. So I don't think this argument has been formally labeled. I'm torn between Patience, Young Grasshopper and It Ain't Over Till the Fat Lady Sings. And now for a brief story from, again, my experience performing medicine in a correctional setting. Last week we talked about a situation of bad things happening to good people. This is the opposite. This is good things happening to bad people. Of course, the terms good and bad, I'm kind of being fast and loose with these for the purpose of illustration. So this patient, in this case, I only have indirect knowledge of, but I did seek to confirm the facts with various members of the team to make sure it was as accurate as possible. We may have been aware of the term and the condition of house arrest versus being actually in prison in the traditional sense. But there's something else in between those called intermittent service. So theoretically, people who are not a big threat to society, whose crimes are not that severe, who have families to feed, jobs to go to, who are pillars of the community, etc. Sometimes this option is offered as an olive branch to that type of offender. What happens is they pretty much have a normal life for the Monday to Friday 9 to 5, and then they work out their sentence over weekends and holidays until however many number of days have been expended. In this case, though, the person in question had deliberately set up a bomb in a children's playground, set up a bomb under a park bench so that they had the ability to remote detonate it. The bomb did not go off yet, presumably because the person wanted the maximum number of people as possible in the park to maximize the damage and the terror that would result. So thankfully, they were arrested before this happened, but because no actual harm had been committed, the judicial system did not treat it as harshly as one might think. And so a person whom you might think would be disappeared or whom would be in Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib or some kind of a, exotic high security prison was actually offered this intermittent service. So they could still maintain their regular job and their regular life for the most part, and they merely had to show up on weekends. Upon further questioning, I was informed that really who gets intermittent service has more to do with how much money you have and how fancy of a legal team you're able to assemble. And that certainly seems to have been the case for this situation. So where does that bring us? How do we kind of conceptualize this? How do we apply it to our life? So as I said before, it's all good to have logic and philosophy and to have things kind of squared away in your brain and your mental side of things, but obviously there's an emotional character that is not so easily satisfied that we also have to consider. As William Lane Craig puts it, he's a well-known Christian apologist and author and philosopher. What's the atheist Bertrand Russell going to say while he's kneeling at the bed of that dying child? Too bad, tough luck, that's the way it goes. So during these two talks, I would ask you to think about which arguments or which defenses or which explanations for the problem of evil resonate the most with you, not only your mind but also your heart, and to cling to those, memorize the associated verses so that when bad times come, which they will, you'll be prepared. The focus of this sermon was the story of Job, which if you want a prepackaged problem of evil type of discussion, it's really high yield. But there are, of course, other aspects of the Bible, kind of an expository approach that do speak to this problem. And I just wanted to highlight some of those passages for your benefit. So 1 Samuel 2:6, this is part of Hannah's song of thanksgiving. She's the mother of Samuel. This is after the dedication of Samuel to Eli's service. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. Basically, the Lord is going to do what the Lord is going to do, and we are powerless to affect change. We must only respond in an appropriate way. 1 Corinthians 15:53, this speaks to the glorification and the mystery of the resurrection and our eternal hope. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. In that way, we are not like the previous atheist comment, looking forward only to oblivion and a short, futile life on earth. Romans 11:33, this is one of the Apostle Paul's doctrinal sermons. In it, he notes that God is ineffable, above us, unable for us to understand, and that wisdom is precious and hard to attain. Oh, the depth of the riches both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. Matthew 23:37, Jesus proclaims woes to the Pharisees. Some of the suffering and evil we face is due to our own rebelliousness and poor decision-making. Not all of it, but some of it. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Romans 8:20-21 speaks to original sin and the necessity of the potential for evil given freedom of choice in a fallen world. This is like the you can't confine your child to his room forever example. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Hebrews 12:11, this is an example of the pedagogical view of evil, or the functionalism side of it, or the idea of discipline having value. Again, this is only a subset of the total evil that exists. So if somebody is going through something, it may be further discipline and development, but not necessarily. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Then Genesis 50:20, this context is Joseph forgiving his brothers for having sold him into slavery. He suffered for a while, but subsequently lived a charmed life due to the providence and miraculous interventions by God. In the end, he was able to save many innocent people from dying of starvation during the famine, including many of his own family and tribe. Sometimes evil might be part of God's greater plan. If it's not caused by God, it might be at least permitted by him. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. Okay, and then just some take-home points for us to reflect upon. So, number one, don't be like Job's friends. Again, in part one of my talk, I did emphasize that although we criticized Job's friends, they did several things right. They dropped what they were doing, they traveled many miles, they sat in silence for 7 days, and they, were in kind of sackcloth and ashes. It's when they opened their mouth and revealed their judgment and lack of compassion when they went astray. So what Job's friends said could be taken of being like a perverse form of the prosperity gospel. I suppose we could call it the adversity gospel. So if bad things are happening to somebody, we need not feel bad for them or try to help them, because that is the just desserts for the sin in their lives. So obviously that is an example of how not to think and what not to do. Number two, sober decisions. If we're comfortable with facing evil and making sense of it, we have a better chance of sustaining our own faith during times of tragedy, or when attacked by atheists or doubters, or when trying to help others. So of course there's the whole mind versus feeling side of things, as I outlined, but it is good to have things pre-planned and premeditated when possible. Number three, teachable moments. Some of the greatest teachable moments in life, in faith journey, and in my profession in medicine are when some calamity occurs. The best time to talk to somebody about quitting smoking is after they've had a major heart attack. We should be opportunistic, but not predatory when helping others. Number four, one size does not fit all. We must try to avoid overly trite comments or truisms. We should meet the person where they are at. It is wise to anticipate their needs, but sometimes it is best to just explicitly ask them, what can I do for you right now? This could be a hug. This could be a platter of lasagna. This could be mowing their lawn. It could be anything. It could be nothing. I would also say this point is also important in terms of how you explain and justify and illustrate the problem of evil. So as I had mentioned before, if there's something that resonates with you and which comforts you, that's valuable, and you should take note of that and you should write it down. But that same point or that same perspective may not have meaning for the person that you're trying to counsel, and don't be surprised if it doesn't. Finally, not why, but how. When overwhelmed by hopeless and suffering, we should focus on the how we cope and rely upon God all the more, instead of perseverating on why. Why me? Why now? Why would you let this happen? And I just leave you with one quotation which kind of sums this up. Grace teaches us in the midst of life's greatest comforts to be willing to die, and in the midst of its greatest crosses to be willing to live. Go in peace.